In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace a front bearing on your Acura MDX located behind the front wheel. Let's get started. Using a 19mm socket, we're going to remove the tire. Remove the tire. We're going to remove the caliper assembly using a 19mm socket. We're going to remove these two bolts. Break them loose. And remove them. Once you have the bolts out, simply grab your whole assembly, slide it out of the way, and place it on top of the knuckle. When you do this, make sure you're not putting any pressure on the hose. To make sure this doesn't fall on us, I'm going to be attaching the caliper assembly to the strut by using a small hook. And when you do this, you want to make sure you don't put any pressure on the hose, and you want to make sure that it's out of the way. We're going to be removing this clip using a set of needle nose pliers. We're simply going to grab it, twist it, and slide it out. Now we're going to remove this nut. Using a 19mm ratcheting wrench, we're going to be taking it off. Once you have it loose, simply remove it. And now we're going to be tapping around this area to break the bottom ball joint loose. Now check with a pry bar. And now that you have it broken loose, we're going to be using a bigger pry bar to pry down on the control arm and getting it off the knuckle. So once you do that, move the whole knuckle out of the way. We're going to remove the rotor screw using a Phillips head. And I'll take the rotor off. Using a 36mm socket, we're going to be removing the axle nut. Take it off. And now we want to take the speed sensor off the knuckle. This will avoid causing some damage. Using a 10mm socket, we're going to remove that bolt and slide the sensor out. If it helps, you can wiggle the sensor side to side while you apply some force and slide it out of the way. Now we're going to be removing the outer tie rod. Using a 22mm socket, remove the nut. Take it off. Now we're going to tap in this area to take the outer tie rod off. When you do this, make sure you don't hit the treads. Now that it's loose, simply slide it off and move it out of the way. Now that we have the tie rod off, we're going to grab the whole assembly on the bottom, and we're going to be pulling pressure this way to slide the axle out of the hub. Simply just move it out of the way to give you room. Now that we have the axle off the hub, we just want to put the lower control arm onto the knuckle temporarily so it gives us enough strength to pull on the hub. So pry down on your lower control arm. Slide your knuckle in. Once you have it lined up, simply push it in. And just to hold it in place, we're going to put the nut by hand and bottom it out. Now we can take the hub off. So to remove the hub, we have two options. We can either take the whole knuckle off and bring it to a press. For this demonstration, I'm going to be using a slide hammer. Now that we have the tool set up, we're gonna attempt to remove it. And now that we have the hub off, we're ready to remove the bearing. Using a C-clip removal tool, we're gonna be taking out the C-clip that holds the bearing in place. Slide one side out, and then you can use a flathead screwdriver and drive it out. Place your hand over it so it doesn't shoot and hit you in the face. And that's out. Now we're ready to remove our bearing, and for that we're going to be using this specialty tool to help us take it out. Line up the back. When you do this, you want to make sure to be as center as possible, and that's going to help the bearing to come out. Now that we have the tool set up, I'm going to be using a 24mm socket to tighten this bolt, and I'm going to be using an adjustable wrench to hold the bag. Now that we have the bearing out, we're going to be removing the tool. And getting it out of the way. Before we install the new one, there's going to be a few things we got to do. One is to make sure that we go the right way. This black strip will be your magnetic sensor that reads the speed every time this rotates. So we want to make sure we install it going this way. This right here, you can tell the difference. If you look in here, this looks more like a seal, and this is more flat. So you want this facing the inside of the vehicle. Before we install the new one, we want to clean our surfaces. Now we're ready to grab a rag and some brake parts cleaner. We're going to spray it and wipe it off. We just want to make sure that it's not debris before we slide the new one in place. To install the new one, we are going to just get it set and straight before we set up the tool. With a mallet, we're gonna lightly tap around it and just set it in place. Like I said, very, very light. Now we're gonna be using an installation tool to press the bearing into place. I'm going to be using a 27mm socket to turn the bolt in the back and an adjustable wrench to hold this in place. And we're going to just go ahead and tighten it, and what that's going to do is going to bring the bearing inwards. We're going to work it out until it bottoms out. I'm doing this to avoid damaging the bearing with the gun, so just take your time. Once we bottom out the bearing, we're going to remove our tool. Now that we have the bearing bottomed out, we're going to be installing our C-clip. Simply slide it in while putting pressure on it, clip it in place, and make sure that it is all the way around, and it looks like that. If you're reusing the hub, we have to sometimes remove some of the bearing that gets stuck to it. That's perfectly fine. I'm gonna be cutting a slot on it and sliding it off. There's different ways to remove this right here. Like I said before, if you're reusing your hub, you need to remove this piece. That piece is part of the old bearing. In this case, I'm going to be using a grinding wheel and I'm gonna be cutting a slot to weaken the part and then hammer it off. And by cutting a slot, I mean like this, where you weaken the part. When you do this, be very careful. You do not wanna hit the hub. Once you have that on, you should be able to grab in this case, I have a small pry bar. You should be able to grab a hammer and hit it, and it should slide off. So you wanna come over here. And just pry the old one out. Just like this. Before we install our hub, we want to make sure that this area is clean. For that, I'm going to be using some brake parts cleaner. We're going to spray some on it. Grab a rag. And make sure that it's free of debris. Now that we have our hub free of debris, we want to simply start it by tapping lightly on the mat with a mallet. And that's just gonna hold it in place. Meanwhile, we set it up for a press. Using this tool, we're gonna be pressing the hub into the bearing. We're gonna be setting it up. And like I mentioned before, you wanna be as center as possible. Using a 27mm socket, I'm gonna be tightening this bolt, and that's gonna be pressing the hub onto the bearing. Holding it back and tightening this. I'm doing this by hand to avoid any damage using the impact gun. Once you bottom out the hub, we're just simply gonna remove our tool. Take everything off. And now we're ready to reinstall the axle in the hub. Now that we have the hub in place, we're gonna be removing this lower ball joint, which we put in by hand. Simply remove the nut. Now we're gonna grab a pry bar. We're gonna pry down on the control arm. Move the ball joint out of the way. Now that we have the control arm off the knuckle, we're simply going to pry out on the whole assembly and slide the axle in. Just like that. Now that we have the axle in place, we're gonna do the opposite, and we're gonna slide our control arm back onto the knuckle. Using the big pry bar, you're gonna put some pressure, pry down, align your knuckle and your ball joint. Once you have it set up like that, you can simply push it in. It should go in place, just like that. Reinstall your lower ball joint nut. Start it by hand. Now that we have the nut bottomed out, this gets torqued to 65 foot-pounds. In this case, we're gonna be doing our best because we cannot get a torque wrench here. Now that we have the bottom ball joint torqued, we're gonna reinstall the pin. Simply line it up with the hole and slide it in. Make sure you hear it click, and you should be good. Now we're ready to reinstall our tie rod. Simply slide it into the knuckle, line up the hole. Start the nut by hand, and bottom it out. Once you have it bottomed out, this knot gets torqued down to 44 foot-pounds. And one thing to note, this style of knot does not have a locking pin. Yours may vary. If it does, you're gonna be reinstalling that now. Now we're ready to reinstall the speed sensor. We're gonna align the hole and slide it in. Reinstall the 10mm bolt. Start it by hand. And now this bolt gets torqued down to 6.9 foot-pounds. Now we're ready to reinstall our rotor, and you want to make sure you lined up the hole with the hub so we can install the rotor bolt. Using a Phillips screwdriver, we're gonna put the bolt in and tighten it. For this, we don't have to tighten that much because that only holds the rotor in place for when we take the wheel off. That's all that's there for. Now we're ready to reinstall our caliper assembly. Simply slide it off from the hook that we installed earlier, making sure we don't put any pressure on the hose. Now we're gonna reinstall the caliper assembly. Once we have it in place, we're gonna reinstall our bolts, line up the holes, and start them by hand. Do the same for the top one. Now we're gonna bottom them out. And now we're gonna torque them to 101 foot-pounds. I'm gonna be starting at the bottom. And I'm gonna be doing the same at the top. Now we're ready to reinstall the axle nut. Simply start it by hand. We're gonna be bottoming it out. And now we're ready to torque down this knot to 242 foot-pounds. And to help torque down this bolt, because it is a lot of torque, we're gonna be using a flathead screwdriver. We're gonna wedge it in between the rotor and the bracket for the caliper. And that's gonna help it hold it in place when you turn this knot. As you can see, it locks it in place. So now we can turn it and get to 242 foot-pounds. Just like that. Now we can remove our screwdriver. And now we wanna make sure that we lock the knot in place. In this case, I'm gonna be using a small screwdriver and a hammer. Simply find the slot, put your screwdriver like this, and hit it. It should look something like that. Now we can install the tire back on. Start your lug nuts by hand. And snug them. Now we're gonna torque down our wheel to 80 foot-pounds in a star pattern. And you're all set.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.